Hi there, my name is Ryan. Today I'd like to talk about Spiritfarer and how it crafts an emotionally resonant series of moments by embedding reliance in the relationship the player has with a beloved NPC. The game is about taking departed souls on a cruise through the world whilst they come to terms with their time alive. You help them with their past relationships, cook them lovely food, and when they feel ready, take them to the Everdoor and say their last goodbyes. The core loop of gathering, crafting and upgrading is reminiscent of relaxing social simulation games like Animal Crossing, but the core premise of Spiritfarer hooked me until the very end. But there is one particular character and their story which Thunder Lotus Games managed to communicate wonderfully through some simple objectives: Alice the Hedgehog. Spiritfarer is mechanically a simple game. NPCs give you quests, you fetch items, go places, cook food, talk to other NPCs. If that sounds familiar, it's probably because that quest structure is prevalent in a lot of games, but that doesn't matter at all in Spiritfarer. The framing of this game is so strong that it brings these rote mechanical tasks to life. That framing starts with a strong narrative premise, great writing, a delightful aesthetic, and characterful animation. Because of this strong framing from so many angles, each task, each conversation is layered with so much meaning. Because the very purpose of the final objective holds so much weight, it makes interactions with each of these souls that much more emotionally resonant. One of these souls is Alice, a mild-mannered hedgehog of swiftly advancing years who doesn't like to impose on anyone. Alice was a stay-at-home mum who looked after her kids. She helps you catch nebula pill bugs, loves old-fashioned food and dessert. When she's happy, she'll shop for ingredients and pick fresh fruit for you. Through her questline, she teaches the player to shear the wool off sheep for use in the loom, to improve the kitchen, and plant an orchard, where she fondly reminisces over the time spent with her family. As she comes out of her shell, she asks the player to accompany her on an adventure, just like in the Swedish romance novels she so loves. It's at this point, as she is recounting the excitement of her favourite novel, that the tragedy of her own story starts to set in. Just as she finally finds some time to pursue her own desires, the frailty of Alice's body catches up with her. Her movement slows, and she requires the player to hold onto her hand as they return to the ship. From here, Alice begins to rely more heavily on the player to get around the ship, particularly as her mind suffers from the effects of dementia. Though Spiritfarer is a game about dealing with death, this is a particularly heartbreaking arc. Dementia robs Alice of that adventurous urge which only just came to the fore. Instead of presenting this to the player from a distance as they progress the questline, the developers embed the player character within Alice's struggles. They create an experience of reliance through constraint. The first instance of this happening is following Alice's adventure in Nordweiler, where she wants to go back to the ship. Ordinarily, an NPC would travel to the ship at their own pace and the player would head back whenever they want. In this situation though, Alice needs to hold on to the player's arm. They travel at half speed together through the town and back to the ship. The player is constrained from their own run speed to experience Alice's limited mobility. This movement is constrained in later quests when the player needs to help Alice up to the prow of the ship. Every quest from this point communicates Alice's limited mobility and the confusion brought on by dementia. The player must rearrange the ship to make sure that Alice's cottage is on the bottom floor because she doesn't do well with ladders anymore. Another constraint is when Alice is having difficulty telling the difference between the player character and her daughter. The player is asked to put on clothes similar to that which Alice's daughter would wear. This introduces the player to the wardrobe feature, where they can change the colour of their clothes. Now, it's a small constraint for this questline, but the way the mechanic is introduced to the player through Alice's confusion layers the situation on the player through another constraint that they have to actively engage with. On that request from earlier to take her to the prow of the ship, the developers introduce a twist to the regular progression of game time. Usually, questline change only occurs in the game state when the player does something like activate or complete a quest, talk to an NPC, discover a new island, or construct a new building. In this example, Alice has to ascend a few stairs to get to the prow of the ship and requires assistance for this. She also needs assistance to get down, and if the player doesn't account for this before going to bed, Alice will be left out in the cold all night. The developers use that traditional game time stasis to show you that this character relies on you beyond where a player might be expected to. That switch from game time advancing by player action to game time advancing by player inaction is used to devastating effect here. Though we might not be expecting that switch, admonishment lies not at the feet of the game for any duplicity in communication, but at the players for their neglect of Alice. Through the guilt players might feel over forgetting her needs, or by pretending to be someone they're not with different clothes, there is a dependence established in this relationship that goes beyond regular player-NPC bonds. And this relationship is a combination of the brilliant framing spoken about before, working in concert with these mechanical constraints. Death is such a core part of our lives, with everyone having their own tales of loss. Spiritfarer deals not just with death, but how people reconcile with their own mortality and the grieving process. The game doesn't just present these as stories to be witnessed, but lives to be actively helped as they come to a close. The player is not a passive observer, but intimately involved in end-of-life care. I've tried to write this video several times in the last year, but I couldn't work past my own grief to do it. Alice as a character represents the frailty that comes with old age and reminded me of my own granny. I think about how loved she was and how we struggled with seeing her memory start to go, or when she would take a fall and would be injured. The character of Alice resonated with me because of my own experience and helped me reflect on that loss and try to deal with it even though it still stings. That grief is representative of the love you have for that person. And yet for all this grief, Spiritfarer is a joy to play. It's about bringing happiness to those at the end of their lives. It's about helping them tie up their loose ends. It's simply about being there for other people. In a medium saturated with games about the various ways to harm others, it's truly refreshing to play a game where you can spread joy with hugs. Thanks for watching. Spiritfarer is a truly wonderful game that I enjoyed from start to finish and would heartily recommend to anyone and everyone. There's a link below to a documentary about the making of Spiritfarer and a link to one of my own videos on the first game by the studio, Jotun, that talks about how Thunder Lotus crafted an amazingly tense level with the world serpent Jormungandr. Take care everyone.